Chapter 1, the hairline fracture. Dinner was already on the table when Monica said it. They had fallen into one of their familiar Friday night rhythms. Shoes kicked off near the door, sleeves rolled up, the low hum of the dishwasher as a kind of white noise punctuation. Ben had poured the wine while Monica talked about a client who insisted on reintroducing Comic Sans into a professional proposal like it was a personal vendetta against taste. He laughed at the right moments. She stole mushrooms from his plate. Everything felt earned in that way long relationships feel earned. Not exciting but solid. It was exactly that solidity that made the sentence land the way it did. "Oh," Monica said, casually spearing pasta. "Evan reached out today. He's going to be in town next week and asked if we could grab coffee. Just for closure." Ben didn't stop chewing. He didn't raise an eyebrow or stiffen or ask her to repeat herself, which later he would recognize as the first conscious decision of the evening. Keep his face neutral, his voice steady, his body obedient to the choreography of normalcy. "That's unexpected," he said after swallowing. He even smiled, small and polite, like a man being told a train might be late. "Yeah," she replied. "But it's been years. I think it could be good." Good, Ben thought, was a generous word. He nodded, because nodding was easier than speaking and speaking required choosing words carefully. He had always been careful with words. It was one of the things Monica loved about him, that he didn't react impulsively, that he listened, considered, weighed. He liked that about himself too. It had saved him a lot of unnecessary explosions over the years. Still, something inside him shifted, not sharply but perceptibly, like a crack forming beneath the surface of ice. The kind you didn't hear right away but felt in your feet. They continued eating. Monica told him Evan lived in Seattle now, that he'd reached out after seeing one of her photos online. She mentioned it conversationally, unaware, or perhaps choosing not to notice, that Ben had stopped tasting his food. 3 years, Ben thought. They'd been together 3 years. Lived together for 2. Talked about houses in abstract ways and kids in hypothetical voices that sounded suspiciously like hope. They didn't use the word forever often, but they didn't shy away from it either. It lived in the pauses, in the shared glance when walking past open houses, in the familiarity of folding laundry side by side. And Evan hadn't been in her life for 4 years. For exactly what required closure after 4 years? That was the question that began circling, slow at first, then insistently. It wasn't jealousy, not in the way jealousy was typically described. Ben had never been territorial. If someone wanted to leave, he believed they'd find a way regardless of rules or restrictions. Love, to him, was not a leash. The patterns mattered. "So," Monica said, twirling a strand of hair around her finger, "you're okay with it, right?" The question was light, almost rhetorical, as though the answer were already settled. Ben took a sip of wine to buy himself a heartbeat. He considered the question not in terms of permission but in terms of alignment. "I'm listening," he said finally. "Tell me what closure means to you." She blinked, surprised, then smiled. "It's just unfinished emotional business, I guess. We never really talked about how things ended." Ben nodded again. He could feel the part of himself that believed in taking people at their word engaging in a quiet debate with the part that noticed what people didn't say. "Okay," he said, and he meant it. Mostly. They didn't argue. That was important. They never raised voices or made accusations. They finished dinner, split dessert, watched half an episode of a show they'd already seen twice. Monica leaned her head on his shoulder, warm and familiar. But something had changed. Later, lying in bed, Monica asleep beside him, Ben stared at the ceiling and allowed himself to follow the thought all the way through for the first time. If the ex was truly in the past, closure wouldn't be necessary. Closure was what you sought when a door was still ajar in your mind, when something unresolved periodically knocked. Maybe she didn't realize the implication. Maybe she did and hoped it wouldn't matter. He didn't think she was cheating. The idea itself felt melodramatic, like borrowing trouble from a future that hadn't arrived yet. Monica wasn't deceptive by nature. She was warm, earnest, occasionally conflict avoidant but not unkind. And still, Ben had learned something essential in his adult life. Trust wasn't the absence of doubt. It was the presence of evidence over time. Love wasn't what people said when everything felt easy. It was what they did when things became complex. He rolled onto his side carefully, so as not to wake her. Monica murmured, half asleep, and curled closer to him. He wrapped an arm around her out of habit, out of affection, out of muscle memory. "I'm not leaving," he thought. Not yet. But he also wasn't willing to pretend this feeling didn't exist. He had never believed in tests or ultimatums. He wasn't conducting some silent trial to see if Monica would choose him over her past. That kind of power play felt juvenile and unnecessary. People revealed their priorities without being forced. What he needed, what he required, was transparency. Privacy, yes. Everyone deserved parts of themselves that were just theirs. But secrecy was different. Secrecy was the decision to exclude someone because you knew the truth might change how they saw you. He wasn't there yet. He hoped he never would be. But the certainty he'd carried into dinner, that effortless assumption of shared direction, had fractured. Not shattered. Fractures healed, sometimes stronger if set correctly. Time would tell. For now, Ben closed his eyes and let sleep come, resolved on one thing only. He would watch patterns, not words, and he would believe what he saw. Chapter 2, Reasonable Thoughts at Midnight. Ben woke at 2:17 a.m. with the unreasonable certainty that if he lay perfectly still, the feeling might pass. It did not. The apartment was dark in that soft, familiar way that had once made him feel safe. Edges blurred, corners known. Monica slept beside him, her breathing slow and even, one arm flung across his chest like an unconscious claim. He stared at the ceiling, which he had repainted last year after a leak, and catalogued its faint imperfections the way someone else might count sheep. This is fine, he told himself. Reasonable people could disagree about closure without it meaning disaster. Reasonable people did not, however, feel like someone had quietly rearranged their internal furniture without warning. He closed his eyes and replayed the evening, not the words exactly but the tone. Monica hadn't been defensive or secretive. She hadn't whispered or hesitated. That mattered. If there was deception, it wasn't loud. But neither was it completely absent. Ben turned onto his side, carefully extricating himself from Monica's arm. He padded into the living room and sat on the couch, the leather cool against his skin. The city outside was silent in the way only early morning silence could be, temporary, expectant. He believed in reason. It had served him well professionally and personally. Reason said adults sometimes revisited old chapters for emotional clarity. Reason said 3 years of trust didn't evaporate over coffee. Reason said insecurity disguised as intuition was still insecurity. Reason was excellent at sounding calming. Unfortunately, intuition had a different tone. It asked inconvenient questions and refused to whisper. What closure exactly? Why now? And why had this never come up before? He realized, with a faint twist of irony, that he had built an entire narrative of Monica's past without ever asking for details. He hadn't wanted to be the man who interrogated old ghosts. He'd assumed if something mattered, she'd tell him. Assumptions, it turned out, were not the same as knowledge. Ben rubbed his face with both hands and laughed softly, the sound dry and humorless. Somewhere along the line, being easygoing had started masquerading as emotional minimalism. He prided himself on not crowding partners, on not demanding constant disclosure. But disclosure wasn't the same as surveillance. He wasn't owed every thought Monica had ever had. That idea repulsed him. Love didn't entitle you to omniscience. What it did entitle you to, what it required even, was honesty when something might affect the shared future you were allegedly building. He stood and poured himself a glass of water. The sink light clicked on too brightly, and he winced like a vampire confronted by truth. I'm not spiraling, he told the empty kitchen. I'm assessing. The kitchen did not disagree. By morning, he had slept again but not deeply. He woke before his alarm, eyes gritty, mind already moving. Monica rolled over and mumbled something affectionate he couldn't quite decipher, then smiled at him with practiced warmth. Morning, she said. You're up early. Yeah, he replied. Couldn't turn my brain off. She leaned in and kissed his cheek, soft and familiar, then went to shower. Ben sat on the edge of the bed and watched the steam curl under the bathroom door, feeling oddly like an observer in his own life. Over coffee, they talked about errands, groceries, dry cleaning, whether they should finally replace the couch cushion that collapsed if you sat on it at the wrong angle. It was domestic and normal and strangely disorienting, like having a pleasant conversation in a house with a cracked foundation. So, Monica said, stirring cream into her mug, you didn't seem upset last night. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. There it was. The invitation, mild but intentional. I wasn't upset, he said. I was surprised. That's fair. She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. I didn't think it would be a big deal. I'm not making it one, Ben said evenly. I just want to understand. She nodded, relieved, and launched into a brief, tidy explanation of her past with Evan. College relationship. Intense but incompatible. Bad timing, bad communication, mutual immaturity. The way people described old loves once they'd been distilled into anecdotes. Ben listened, asked no questions, stored impressions rather than facts. When she finished, she smiled like someone who'd closed a file. See? Not dramatic. He smiled back because smiling felt like the socially correct thing to do. You're right, he said. Not dramatic. After she left to run errands, Ben remained at the table long after his coffee cooled. He stared at the empty chair across from him and acknowledged something he hadn't allowed himself to articulate yet. He was already pulling away. Not consciously, not deliberately, just a fraction of a step back, enough to observe without attachment. Enough to protect himself if the story turned in a direction he didn't like. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't a game. It was reactive self-preservation, honed by experience and disappointment he rarely talked about. He didn't call a friend. He wasn't ready for opinions or jokes or reassurance. He went for a run instead, letting the repetitive impact on concrete quiet his thoughts. Physical logic, he called it. Move forward, breathe, repeat. By the time he returned, sweaty and marginally calmer, he had arrived at a temporary truth that felt fair. He would not demand anything. But he would pay attention. If Monica volunteered information, if she brought him into the process rather than around it, that would matter. If she compartmentalized, minimized, or brushed off reasonable curiosity, that would matter too. Love, Ben believed, was not blind faith. It was conscious choice supported by consistent behavior. He showered, dressed, and went about his day. From the outside, nothing was wrong. He sent Monica a light-hearted text about a stray dog that had chased him for a block. She replied with laughing emojis and a heart. The world did not end. And yet, something had shifted permanently. That night, when Monica curled against him again, he held her and felt both present and slightly removed, like standing in warm water while watching the shoreline. Time, he knew, would answer questions better than confrontation ever could. For now, he would watch. Chapter 3, What Coffee Costs. By Tuesday morning, the coffee had acquired a weight it didn't deserve. It was just coffee. Ben reminded himself as he tightened his tie in the bathroom mirror. Hot water, ground beans, two people sitting across from each other, making eye contact like functional adults. Civilization ran on less. Wars were not fought over cafes. And yet, Monica stood behind him, brushing her hair, her movements precise in a way Ben hadn't noticed before. She was dressed carefully, jeans, boots, a soft sweater that lived in the sweet spot between casual and flattering. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't suspicious. It was intentional. You don't have to dress up, Ben said lightly, meeting her eyes in the mirror. She smiled, a touch too quick. I'm not. I just have a meeting afterward. Of course, he said. He believed her in the literal sense. It was the subtext that had gone fuzzy. They parted with their usual goodbye kiss. Hers lingered a second longer, like punctuation. Ben watched her walk down the hall and felt as though a chapter of his life had been released into the wild without supervision. At work, he was productive in the way people were productive when they were avoiding other thoughts. He answered emails with crisp efficiency, solved problems that previously would have merited a meeting. His boss complimented him on his focus. Been sleeping well? She asked. Like a champion, Ben lied pleasantly. The coffee happened at 11. Ben knew this because Monica had said it in passing the night before. The time dropped casually into conversation like a napkin, as though he wouldn't hold on to it. He didn't text her beforehand. He didn't ask how she felt or wish her luck or joke about exes like he might have in a different version of this relationship. He waited. Waiting turned out to be less passive than it sounded. He watched the clock without meaning to. He imagined benign versions of the meeting and discarded each one as implausible. He had always been gifted with imagination, but usually it worked in his favor. Around noon, his phone buzzed. His heart did a traitorous little jump before logic caught up. Lunch ran long. Headed back to the office, Monica texted. No emoji. No addendum. He stared at the message longer than necessary, then set the phone face down on his desk like it might confuse him further if it remained visible. Lunch ran long. Language was fascinating that way. Coffee became lunch. Closure expanded. Time shifted. Ben wasn't panicking. Panic implied chaos, a loss of function. This was closer to calibration. Adjusting expectations. Realigning internal projections with new data. He finished out the day and went home on autopilot, stopping at the grocery store because it was on his mental list and he trusted lists more than feelings. At home, he cooked dinner deliberately, chopping vegetables with a calm efficiency that bordered on monk-like. Monica arrived late, more tired than usual, heat in her cheeks from the cold. Hey, she said, kicking off her shoes. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to go so long. That's okay, Ben said easily. I made stir-fry. She smiled, grateful. You're the best. He accepted the compliment without commentary. They ate at the counter, side by side instead of across from each other. It was their habit on busy days. Familiar, comfortable. So, he said after a few minutes, how was it? She took a sip of water, considering. It was fine. A little awkward at first, but we caught up. Ben murmured. He apologized for some things, she added quickly. Nothing dramatic. Ben chewed thoughtfully. How'd that make you feel? She shrugged. Validated, I guess. The word landed between them, heavier than it should have been. I'm glad, Ben said. He meant it. Validation was good. Healing was good. Closure, in theory, was good. But as the evening went on, something subtle took shape. Monica talked around the meeting rather than through it. Details were smoothed over, emotional peaks flattened. It wasn't lying. It was curating. Ben asked no follow-up questions. He went to wash dishes and let the warm water distract him. He noticed how easily he could imagine this conversation becoming the new normal, surface assurances, selective transparency. It wasn't catastrophic. It was sustainable, even. It was also not what he wanted. Later, they sat on the couch, a show playing neither of them was truly watching. Monica rested her legs across his lap. Ben absently traced circles on her ankle, a gesture comfort had made automatic. You're quiet, she said. Just tired, he replied. She studied him, then leaned in and kissed him, soft at first, then more deliberately. Normally, he would have melted into it. Tonight, he responded but didn't initiate, didn't deepen. She pulled back slightly. Are we okay? Ben hesitated. The truth fractured into multiple possible truths, each with different consequences. We're fine, he said finally. I just want us to keep being transparent with each other. We are, she said, a little defensive. He met her gaze. I know. I just want to stay that way. There was a pause. Monica nodded, but something flickered behind her eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or discomfort. Then it was gone. They went to bed without resolving anything, which itself felt like resolution avoidance. Ben lay awake listening to the rhythm of Monica's breathing, feeling the distance not as absence but as restraint. He wasn't pulling away to punish her. He was pulling away to preserve himself. In the days that followed, the pattern emerged with quiet predictability. Monica mentioned Evan once more, casually, as though correcting an error. He texted to thank me for meeting up, she said. I told him I hoped he found what he was looking for. Ben nodded. Did he? She smiled faintly. I don't know. Neither did Ben. But he knew something else now. Coffee, it turned out, didn't cost much money. But it exacted its price elsewhere, in attention, in emotional bandwidth, in the tiny unspoken choices people made when deciding what to share and what to keep. And Ben was paying attention. Chapter 4. Lines drawn in pencil. If you had asked Ben to describe what changed after the coffee, he would have struggled to give you a dramatic answer. Nothing collapsed. No fight erupted. Monica did not transform into some unrecognizable version of herself. In fact, on the surface, things continued much the same as they had before. Shared dinners, weekend plans, a running joke about whose turn it was to buy toilet paper. But beneath that normalcy, Ben began to redraw his emotional boundaries in pencil. He still showed up. He still asked about her day. Still listened. Still offered comfort when she complained about her boss or worried aloud about her sister. What he didn't do anymore was project. He stopped imagining future versions of them with the same instinctive ease. The visions were still there, but he treated them like sketches rather than blueprints. It was subtle enough that Monica didn't comment on it. That, in itself, became its own data point. On Thursday night, Ben met his friend Marcus for a beer after work. They'd been friends since their mid-20s, bonded by a shared preference for dry humor and the ability to disagree without turning it into sport. Marcus slid into the booth across from him, jacket half off, already scanning the beer list. You look like a man carefully avoiding his own thoughts, Marcus said. I respect it. Ben smiled. I'm refining them. Ah, the deluxe package. They ordered, talked about work, mutual acquaintances, the unavoidable march of time. Marcus waited. He was good at waiting. Eventually, Ben sighed. Monica had coffee with her ex. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Feelings. That's sort of the problem, Ben said. I don't know what I feel yet. Marcus considered that. That sounds like feelings. Helpful, Ben deadpanned. Look, Marcus said, leaning back. You're not jealous. You're unsettled. There's a difference. That's what I keep telling myself. What are you actually worried about? Ben swirled his beer and stared at the foam. I'm worried she needed something from him that she didn't think she could get from me. Or that she didn't think I should know she needed. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, that'll do it. I don't think she did anything wrong, Ben added. But wrong isn't the standard. Alignment is. That's very on-brand for you, Marcus said. Emotionally principled but allergic to ultimatums. I don't want to control her, Ben said. I just don't want to invest blindly. Marcus lifted his glass. Then don't. It was infuriating advice in its simplicity. You sound like you think this ends badly, Ben said. I think, Marcus replied carefully, that when someone pulls back the emotional curtain a little and then closes it again, the person watching has to decide whether they're okay with that view forever. Ben took a sip. I'm not. Then there you go. At home, Monica was curled up on the couch, laptop open, glasses slipping down her nose. She looked up when he walked in and smiled in that automatic way that still worked on him. Hey, how is Marcus? Good, Ben said, hanging up his coat. Same as ever. They fell into their evening routine. Dinner was leftovers, plates balanced on their knees. Monica laughed at something on her screen and showed it to him. He laughed too, genuinely. This, he thought, was the hard part. There was still so much to like. Still comfort. Still love in some shape. Halfway through the meal, Monica said, Evan asked if I wanted to get coffee again before he leaves. Ben froze internally, though externally he reached for his fork. And, he asked. I told him probably not, she said. One was enough. Ben waited. I didn't think it would be a good idea, she added after a beat. That mattered. It mattered more than she realized. Thanks for telling me, Ben said quietly. She tilted her head. Of course. Why wouldn't I? He looked at her. Because not everyone would. She frowned slightly, then shrugged. Well, I'm not everyone. No, Ben thought. You're Monica, which is the point. Later that night, as they got ready for bed, Ben noticed another small shift. Monica watching him in the mirror, like she was checking her reflection twice to make sure it was still there. You're thinking again, she said. So are you, he replied gently. She smiled, a little unsure. About what? About whether something's wrong, Ben said. Her lips pressed together. Is something wrong? Here it was, the opening. Not wide enough for a confrontation, but wide enough for honesty if either of them chose it. I'm recalibrating, Ben said after a moment. That's all. That doesn't sound good, she said, attempting a joke. It's not bad either. She studied him, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press. You know you can talk to me. I know, Ben said, and he did. What he also knew was that talking required two people willing to examine the same thing at the same depth. Right now, Monica seemed content to treat the coffee as a closed chapter. Ben was still reading the footnotes. Over the next week, he noticed how easily she slipped back into equilibrium. Her texts were warm, her affection consistent. She laughed readily, planned dinner with friends, talked about a possible trip in the fall. He listened and responded without feeding the fantasy further. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't even conscious. It was simply that something essential had been pencil-marked instead of inked. Easily erased, yes, but no longer permanent by default. One evening, as they brushed their teeth side by side, Monica said, "You feel a little far lately." Ben leaned his elbows on the counter and met her eyes in the mirror. "I'm still here. I know. She sighed. "I don't want you thinking there's something you don't know." He thought of Marcus's phrasing of curtains and views. "Then don't make me guess," Ben said softly but clearly. She swallowed, nodding. "Okay." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't reassurance either. It was a placeholder promise, penciled in like a line waiting to be darkened. Ben kissed her forehead and turned off the light. In bed, as she fell asleep with her hand resting on his chest, he stared into the dark and acknowledged a truth he could no longer ignore. He was already preparing for outcomes, not because he wanted them, but because he respected himself enough to know that if the pencil line stayed light too long, he would choose to step back before the eraser ever came out. And for the first time since the coffee, that knowledge felt less like loss and more like clarity. Chapter 5, The Difference Between Privacy and Silence. The lie of it wasn't in anything Monica said. That was what made it difficult. If she had changed dramatically, become evasive, defensive, hostile, Ben would have known what to do. Clean edges were easier to navigate. But Monica remained herself, affectionate, engaged, checking in when he worked late, still reaching for his hand in public without thinking. It was the omissions that accumulated. Silence, he was learning, had its own vocabulary. On Sunday afternoon, they cleaned the apartment together, music playing loudly enough to negotiate over. Monica danced while she dusted, bumping into Ben's hip with exaggerated flair. "Careful," he said, smiling. "You'll knock the existential crisis off the counter." She laughed. "I think that ship sailed." For a moment, the ease returned so fully that Ben almost hesitated to breathe. This was them. This was real. It wasn't imagined or misremembered. That was the problem. How could something true still feel incomplete? Later, while folding laundry, Monica casually mentioned she'd run into Evan's name again on social media. An update on a mutual friend's post. She said nothing else, just enough to acknowledge it, like someone referencing the weather. Ben nodded, folding a t-shirt with surgical precision. He didn't ask questions. He noticed instead how she framed it as incidental and how she watched him for reaction afterward. There it was again, that moment of calibration. How much to reveal? How much to hold? "You don't have to pre-edit things for me," Ben said gently. She paused. "I'm not." He looked up. "I didn't say you were. Just that you don't have to." Her expression tightened briefly before smoothing. Okay. Okay was not a promise. It was a placeholder. That night, Ben lay awake thinking about definitions. Words mattered to him. They always had. Privacy was the right to own parts of yourself. Silence was the refusal to share when sharing was warranted. Secrecy crossed the line when it protected behavior rather than personhood. He wasn't trying to corner Monica into total disclosure. He didn't need transcripts or timestamps. What he needed was the sense that nothing significant was being curated away from him. Midweek, an opportunity presented itself without drama. Monica came home early, phone in hand, and said, "I'm thinking of grabbing dinner with Jenna tomorrow, just to catch up." Ben smiled. "Sounds good." She mentioned Evan might be in town again, Monica added quickly. "But he won't be there. I wouldn't spring that on you." He studied her face, not suspiciously, just attentively. "I appreciate that." She relaxed. "I don't want there to be weirdness." Ben nodded. "Neither do I." What he didn't say was that weirdness wasn't conjured by events. It was shaped by how people moved around them. The next evening, while Monica was out, Ben cooked for one. He didn't mind it. Solitude had never frightened him. It gave his thoughts room to line up instead of colliding. He realized, with surprising calm, that he had already stopped assuming permanency. Not because he wanted out, but because he could no longer anchor his future to expectations that weren't being reinforced. When Monica returned, she kissed him and thanked him for dinner. They talked about Jenna, about work gossip, about nothing particularly weighty. "Everything okay?" she asked eventually. "Yes," Ben said. Then, after a moment, "But I want to check something." She stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Okay. When something connects to your emotional world, he said carefully. I want to be included, not in a surveilled way, in a shared life way. Monica looked down at her hands. I thought I was including you. You were, Ben said. Partially. She frowned. So what? Do you want a full report every time my past shows up? No. He shook his head. I want to not feel like I'm finding out after the fact. Silence settled between them. Not hostile, but heavy. I didn't think it mattered, Monica said finally. Ben met her eyes. That's where we differ. She looked at him then truly, like she was seeing the shape of his concern instead of the inconvenience of it. I'm not hiding anything. I know, Ben replied. But you're also not offering it. That landed harder. He hadn't intended it to sound like an accusation, but truth often carried weight whether it meant to or not. I don't want to talk about him all the time, Monica said quietly. I don't want that either, Ben said. I want to know when he matters. Her jaw tightened. He doesn't matter. Ben believed she believed that. What he wasn't convinced of was that it was already true. They did not resolve it that night. They didn't escalate it either. They went to bed subdued but affectionate, their bodies finding familiarity even when their words stalled. Ben lay awake again, staring at the dark, and accepted something with sober clarity. He was no longer confused. He loved Monica, but he was beginning to understand that love alone wasn't enough. Clarity mattered. So did reciprocity. So did feeling secure not because you were told to, but because nothing made you second-guess your footing. Privacy could coexist with partnership. Secrecy could not. And if silence persisted, if it continued to fill the spaces where shared understanding should live, then Ben knew what his next line, no longer penciled, would eventually become. But for now, he stayed. Not out of denial, out of respect for himself and for the truth still unfolding. Chapter 6. When patterns repeat themselves, the thing about patterns, Ben realized, was that they rarely announced themselves. They showed up dressed as coincidences, timing, mood. They pretended to be isolated incidents until you looked back and saw the symmetry. Then you couldn't unsee it, no matter how much you wanted to. The realization came on a Wednesday afternoon and arrived without drama. Ben was leaving a meeting early when he spotted Monica across the lobby of his office building. She wasn't supposed to be there. She worked on the other side of town. But there she was, coat slung over her arm, scanning the space like she was orienting herself. Hey, he said, surprised but smiling as he approached. What are you doing here? She startled, then laughed. I was meeting Jenna nearby for coffee. She got delayed, so I figured I'd cut through. Ben nodded automatically, then paused. Coffee? Yeah, Monica said quickly. Just Jenna. There it was. The clarification came unprompted like a reflex. Ben didn't ask who else might have been there. He didn't need to. The moment tightened, then loosened again as if nothing unusual had occurred. That's rare luck, he said easily. Running into you like this. Yeah, Monica agreed, but she was already glancing toward the door. I've got to run, she just texted. They hugged quickly. She kissed his cheek and disappeared into the afternoon foot traffic, leaving Ben standing there with the distinct sensation of déjà vu. It wasn't about Evan anymore. The name itself had lost its edge. It was about Monica adjusting her transparency based on what she anticipated Ben might feel, editing reality in advance instead of trusting it to stand on its own. That was a pattern. Later that night, Ben sat alone on their balcony, nursing a beer he'd already forgotten he poured. The city hum below felt distant and impersonal, like background noise to a thought he'd been circling for weeks. He thought back to another relationship years ago, one he rarely referenced because it didn't hurt anymore, at least not sharply. Back then, he'd ignored the quiet ways someone drifted elsewhere emotionally while insisting everything was fine. He'd stayed longer than he should have out of patience, empathy, optimism. He had learned from that experience, or so he'd thought. Monica joined him on the balcony, wrapping herself in his discarded sweater. She leaned against the railing, close enough that Ben could feel her warmth. You're awfully quiet tonight, she said. He smiled faintly. I'm noticing things. That sounds ominous. Only if you imagine the worst, he replied. She studied him in profile. I don't always know what you're thinking. That's because I don't always talk out loud, Ben said. But I'm consistent. Her brow furrowed. What does that mean? It means, he said calmly, that when something sits with me, it stays until it's resolved, even if I don't push it. She was silent for a moment. Are you still thinking about the coffee? Yes, Ben said without hesitation. And no, she turned to face him fully. That's not exactly comforting. I know. He set his beer down and met her eyes. What I'm thinking about is how you decide what to tell me. Monica crossed her arms, defensive now despite herself. I tell you things. You do, Ben agreed. But sometimes after they've already taken shape. Sometimes only once you know how I might interpret them. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I'm not trying to manage your reactions. I don't think you are, Ben said gently. I think you're managing your discomfort. The truth had a way of settling between people, heavy but balanced. I don't want everything to become a discussion, Monica said quietly. Some things feel easier if they stay contained. Ben nodded. I understand the impulse, but containment changes the relationship, creates distance. That's not what I want, she said quickly. I know, Ben said, but intention and outcome aren't the same thing. She looked away, jaw tight. So what, you think I'm doing something wrong? I think, Ben said slowly, choosing precision over comfort, that you're deciding what I can handle instead of trusting me to handle it. Monica exhaled sharply. I hate that this feels like a problem I didn't know I was creating. Ben smiled sadly. Most problems are. They stood there in silence, the city filling the space neither of them rushed to occupy. Ben felt something settle into place. Not resolve, but understanding. This was the pattern. Not infidelity or betrayal or even lack of love. It was the tendency to keep emotional doors cracked rather than fully open, to smooth edges instead of addressing them directly. He had seen it before, and he knew himself well enough now to know what came next if it didn't change. Monica reached for his hand, squeezing it. I don't want you to feel like you can't trust me. Ben squeezed back, just as firmly. Then don't ask me to trust what I can't see. Her grip tightened, then loosened. That night, lying beside her, Ben acknowledged something with quiet certainty. He wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. He was waiting to see if it ever stopped hovering. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine not what he hoped would happen, but what he would do if the pattern held. The thought didn't scare him, steadied him, because this time, if the familiar shape repeated itself, Ben was ready to step out of it. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but with clear eyes and his dignity intact. The pattern had shown itself. What mattered now was whether it would be interrupted or completed. Chapter 7. Saying the quiet part out loud, they finally stopped dancing around it on a Sunday morning that began politely. Sunlight filled the kitchen in soft bands as Ben stood at the counter slicing strawberries for pancakes. Monica sat at the table scrolling through her phone, hair still damp from the shower, wrapped in one of his old college sweatshirts. It was the kind of domestic scene that used to make Ben feel anchored. This, he once thought, was what people meant when they talked about a life together. Do you want chocolate chips or just fruit? He asked. Both, Monica said without looking up. Then, after a beat, she added, You've been quiet again. Ben set the knife down carefully. He didn't sigh or smile or deflect. He turned and leaned against the counter, meeting her where she was instead of skirting past it. We should talk, he said. Her thumb froze on the screen. She looked up, searching his face. Okay. There it was again, the steadiness. Monica didn't flee from hard conversations. She just didn't always walk into them on her own. Ben gestured toward the table. Can we sit? They did. The pancakes were abandoned, batter waiting patiently while the future shifted shape. I've been trying to figure out how to say this without making it sound like an accusation, Ben began. So I'm just going to say it plainly. Monica nodded, jaw already tense. Okay. I feel like you've been deciding what parts of your life I get access to, Ben said. Not out of malice, out of fear of discomfort. And it's made me pull back. Her eyebrows drew together. I didn't know you were pulling back. I know, he said softly. That's part of it. She looked down at the table, running her finger along a faint water ring. I don't want to hurt you. I know, Ben said again. He meant it. But protecting me from information isn't the same as protecting our relationship. Monica exhaled slowly. I didn't think it was information that mattered. Ben held her gaze. Then why did you manage it so carefully? That landed. The silence that followed wasn't defensive or angry. It was contemplative, like a door finally being opened inward. I don't like unresolved things, Monica said after a moment. They make me restless. Evan represented something unfinished, and I didn't want that feeling bleeding into us. So you handled it on your own, Ben said. Yes, she admitted, because I didn't want it to be a thing. Ben nodded. But it was a thing because you made it solitary. Her eyes filled not dramatically but honestly. I didn't know how to include you without making it heavier. Including me would have made it shared, Ben said. Not heavier. She wiped at her eyes and gave a short laugh. You always do that. Reframe things like they're obvious. That's because they are, he said gently. Just not always easy. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a car passed. Someone laughed in a neighboring apartment. Life continued, indifferent to the careful dismantling happening at their table. I love you, Monica said suddenly, urgently, as if the words might stabilize something. I don't want to lose what we have. Ben felt the weight of the statement, true, powerful, insufficient on its own. I love you too, he said. But love isn't the question. She frowned. Then what is? Whether we see partnerships the same way, Ben replied. I need transparency when something touches your emotional life. Not because I need control, but because I need inclusion. Monica swallowed. And if I don't always know what needs to be included? Then we talk about that, Ben said. But you don't get to decide retroactively. Her shoulders slumped. I think I've been trying to keep everything smooth. And I think smooth has been costing us depth, Ben said quietly. Another long pause. So what now? She asked. Ben considered that carefully. This was the moment, he knew it instinctively, where many relationships turned loud, where ultimatums were issued, promises rushed, vows thrown down like currency. He didn't want that. "I'm not asking you to fix yourself," he said, "and I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm telling you that if this pattern continues, managing instead of sharing, I won't be able to stay fully invested." Her eyes widened. Are you saying we're breaking up?" "No," Ben said. "I'm saying this is a fork." Her mouth trembled. "That feels like pressure." "It's clarity," he replied. "Pressure would be me demanding change without understanding. Clarity is me saying what I can live with." She stared at him, searching for the crack, the threat. Finding none was somehow worse. "So if I mess up again?" she asked. "Then we'll know something important," Ben said. "About alignment." Tears finally fell then, quiet and untheatrical. "I didn't think one coffee would do this." "It didn't," Ben said, reaching across the table and taking her hand. "It revealed something that was already there." She squeezed his fingers. "I don't want to be someone who keeps doors half closed. I don't want to be someone who waits indefinitely at them," Ben said. They sat there, hands linked, sharing grief and affection in equal measure. The love between them was real. Ben had never doubted that. What he doubted now was whether love alone could bridge a fundamental difference in how they navigated vulnerability. Eventually, Monica wiped her cheeks and took a steadying breath. "I need time to think," she said. Ben nodded. "That's fair." As she stood and went to finish getting dressed, Ben returned to the counter and flipped on the burner under the waiting pancake pan. He poured the batter, watching it spread, even predictable. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel anxious or suspended. The quiet part had been said out loud. Whatever came next would be clearer, not because it would be easier, but because it would be honest. And honesty, Ben knew, was the beginning of either rebuilding or letting go. Either way, he could stand on it. Chapter 8, The Shape of Letting Go. The end, when it came, didn't arrive with a bang. It unfolded quietly over a week of altered routines, gentler voices, and conversations that hovered just shy of what they both knew needed to be said. Ben noticed it in the way Monica started leaving for work a little earlier, in how she lingered over her phone before putting it face down on the table, in the careful courtesy that crept into their interactions, an invisible layer of politeness where comfort used to live. They were still kind to each other. That was the hardest part. On Thursday evening, Monica came home with takeout from his favorite Thai place, the one with the peanut sauce he could never quite replicate. She set the bags on the counter and looked at him like she was gathering nerve. "I thought we could eat together," she said. Ben nodded. "I'd like that." They ate at the table instead of the couch. It felt intentional, ceremonial almost. They talked about neutral things at first, work deadlines, a mutual friend's engagement, whether they should keep their names on the lease through summer. Eventually, Monica set her fork down. "I've been thinking," she said. Ben waited. He'd become very good at waiting. "I don't think I'm wired the way you are," she continued. "Emotionally." He tilted his head slightly. "Tell me more." She took a breath. "I need room to process things on my own. I don't always know what something means while I'm in it, and I don't want to feel like I'm failing you when I don't catch that in time." Ben absorbed that with care. There was no malice in her words, just honesty finally spoken without hedging. "I don't think you're failing me," he said. "I think we're asking different things of partnership." Her eyes filled again, but she didn't look away this time. "I tried this week to imagine doing it differently, being more open, even when I'm unsure. And the truth is, it scared me. Not because of you. Because of me." Ben nodded slowly. "Fear doesn't make you unfit. It just tells you where your limits are." "And yours?" she asked quietly. He didn't hesitate. "I need shared visibility, especially around things that could change how we relate to each other. I can't be in a relationship where I'm always waiting for clarity after the fact. It disconnects me from myself." There it was. Not an argument. Not a verdict. A recognition. Monica smiled sadly. "I think we've been loving each other honestly, but fundamentally misaligned." Ben felt the truth of that settle into his chest like a weight he could finally set down. "Yes," he said. "I think we have." They sat in that for a moment, the familiar absence of urgency allowing the reality to land gently rather than shatter. Monica reached across the table and took his hand, the contact both tender and final. "I don't regret us," she said. Ben squeezed her fingers. "Neither do I." They talked then. Not for hours, not exhaustively, but thoroughly enough. About what they'd loved, what they'd learned, what they couldn't bring themselves to be angry about. They decided to separate cleanly, kindly. No drawn-out ambiguity. No pretending friendship would be immediate. By the end of the night, there were plans for logistics and space and a quiet understanding that something meaningful had ended without becoming ugly. Later, alone in the bedroom, Ben folded his clothes into a suitcase with deliberate movements. He paused over a hoodie Monica loved, debated leaving it, then smiled to himself and packed it anyway. Sentiment didn't have to masquerade as practicality. As he zipped the bag, he felt sadness. Not sharp, not panicked, but honest and full-bodied. Grief without chaos. Loss without regret. Monica stood in the doorway watching him. "You're going to be okay," she said. He looked up and smiled. Small but real. So are you. They hugged. Longer than expected. Gentler than they might have months earlier. It wasn't clinging. It was acknowledgement. Ben left shortly after midnight, stepping into the cool air with a strange sense of steadiness. The world felt quieter, not emptier. As he drove away, he didn't replay mistakes or conversations. He thought instead about something he hadn't fully grasped until now. That honoring your needs didn't mean vilifying someone else's limits. Love could be real, and still not be enough to stay. Ben didn't know what came next, not precisely. But he knew this. He hadn't abandoned himself in order to keep something comfortable. He had listened, responded, and walked forward with clarity and tact. That mattered. And as the city lights blurred past, he felt something unexpected stir beneath the sadness. A quiet, resilient sense of forward motion. Not toward someone new yet, just toward himself. Chapter 9. Forward is still forward. Ben learned, in the weeks that followed, that endings had echoes. They showed up in small, mundane moments. The instinct to reach for his phone before remembering there was no one to text about the dumb thing he'd just seen on the sidewalk. The quiet satisfaction of cooking for one without negotiating spice levels. The realization that sadness could coexist with relief without canceling either one out. He took a temporary sublet across town. Furnished sparsely and intentionally. The mattress was good, the couch acceptable, the walls bare. It felt less like loss and more like a reset. Neutral ground where no memories had yet claimed real estate. Mornings became his favorite again. He brewed coffee slowly, stood by the window with the mug warming his palms, watched the neighborhood wake up. There was freedom in the absence of compromise. Not the lonely kind, the clear kind. The kind that let you hear your own thoughts all the way through. Marcus came over one Saturday with takeout and unsolicited commentary. "You look tragically competent," Marcus observed, surveying the apartment. "I give it 2 weeks before you start referring to this as intentional minimalism." Ben laughed. "I already did. Twice." They sat on the floor because the table hadn't arrived yet, cartons between them. Conversation wanders the way it always did with Marcus. Unforced, occasionally insightful in spite of itself. "You doing okay?" Marcus asked eventually. Ben nodded. "Yeah, not euphoric. Not devastated. Just aligned." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "That might be the most Ben answer you've ever given." "I miss her," Ben added. "But I don't miss wondering." Marcus lifted his chopsticks in acknowledgement. "That's called growth. It's unpleasant but effective." Over time, the silence in Ben's life lost its sharp edges. He filled it not with distraction but with intention. He joined a climbing gym mostly because it scared him a little. He reconnected with a cousin he hadn't spoken to in years. He cooked things that took time and attention, recipes that didn't reward multitasking. One night, while waiting for a friend at a bookstore cafe, someone asked to share his table. She had an armful of books and a smile that suggested tolerance rather than expectation. "Sure," Ben said genuinely. They talked about nothing with surprising ease. The weather, a mutual love of marginal notes, why bookstores felt like temporary homes. Her name was Julia. She had a laugh that burst out of her when she didn't attempt to restrain it. When she left, she smiled and said, "This was nice," without asking for more. Ben watched her go and noticed something important. He didn't feel the urge to chase the moment or assign it meaning. That too was growth. Weeks passed. Ben ran into Monica once, briefly, at a grocery store checkout. They smiled, exchanged well wishes, and parted without awkwardness. It felt complete in a way that surprised him. That night, walking home with his groceries, Ben thought about how different the experience was compared to past breakups. No bitterness, no self-recrimination. Just a clear understanding that two good people could fail to build the same structure even with high-quality materials. He no longer questioned his instincts about openness and partnership. The line he'd drawn, quietly, deliberately, felt less like a boundary and more like a compass. Forward, he realized, did not always mean dramatic. Sometimes it meant calm certainty. Sometimes it meant trust in your own judgment, even when the choice cost you something meaningful. On a crisp evening toward the end of fall, Ben sat on a park bench with a notebook balanced on his knee. He wasn't writing anything profound, just lists and ideas and observations, but the act itself felt grounding. A couple passed by laughing, brushing hands. Ben smiled at them without envy, without longing. He stood, tucked the notebook under his arm, and headed home with an easy gait. He didn't know who he would love next, but he knew how, and that knowledge, earned, intact, and unapologetically his, felt like the best beginning he could have asked for.